Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for coming. I'm going to talk about this nexus between agriculture, food, nutrition, and health. And the purpose of giving it to a student audience is the point that I'm going to be making about this really important topic is today's students are going to be tomorrow's heroes in this area. I worked for many years in Australia, but I've had the privilege and the honour of working internationally for over 25 years of my career. And that's really given me a great perspective on agriculture and the importance of agriculture in the world. And, you know, it's my belief that the greatest challenge that faces humankind for the coming decades is global food and nutritional security. How we're going to feed everyone on planet Earth properly. As Herbert mentioned, major part of that involvement overseas when I was Director General of CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in Mexico. Basically a center funded by the richer countries of the world to help the poorer countries of the world. And particularly where maize and wheat are major food security crops. We were headquartered in Mexico, but we had offices in 18 countries around the world, and we worked in over 100 developing countries around the world. I was back at CIMMYT's 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, and as a paper presented there that estimated in the 50 years of its existence, CIMMYT's work had saved over 1 billion lives. There have only been 7 directors general there. I was one of them, the only Australian that's ever been a director general there. And to be involved with something like that is something that obviously makes a big impression on me. Since then, I've done a lot of work for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, based in Rome, working on sustainable intensification. And that's really what we're all going to have to do in agriculture. We're going to have to produce more with less. More food because of more people, but with less land, less water, less energy-rich inputs. And it's going to be a tremendous challenge. But I do see that with sustainable intensification systems that we can achieve that. And that whole theme of sustainability has been one that I've been working on. And, you know, while I've been working overseas, I've had the privilege of meeting and working with princes. I'm invited to a round table at St. James's Palace with Prince Charles. He's very interested in sustainable agriculture. I've worked with presidents, plenty of prime ministers, and had the great honor of working with some Nobel laureates. This is Dr. Norman Borlaug, who's the famous wheat breeder on CIMMYT that helped create the Green Revolution. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. When I was working as Director General there, I had him as my emeritus advisor. Just a tremendous privilege and to be able to delve into, you know, his things. He was a great plant breeder, and, you know, he just believed that you really had to know your material, you know, and so he'd be lecturing to younger plant breeders, and he said, you better get out there and talk to your plants. And what he was getting at was that, you know, that in agriculture, it happens in the field. You know, you better know what's happening in the field. You go out there on a hot afternoon and look at all your wheat varieties, and you see that some are looking pretty happy and some unhappy. Immediately, you know which material to proceed with. And so that was a great education for me. More recently, meeting Muhammad Yunus, Nobel Peace Laureate, for his work in providing microfinance to resource-poor people, particularly farmers in the developing world. And you know, just such a great man. And I did a review for the organisation and had to report back to him. And lastly, meeting winners and working with winners of the World Food Prize. This is Dr. Rajaram, and the world's greatest wheat breeder. His wheat variety is now occupy about 65 million hectares across the world. And most of the wheat varieties we grow here in Australia, about 80 to 90% of them are based on material that Raj has produced. And, you know, I was fortunate enough to appoint him as director of the wheat program while I was working at CIMIC. So, given that, all those things, why am I here? I'm back at the university and particularly here at the Dookie campus. When I was working internationally, I gave a seminar at Stanford. Stanford's one of the top 3 universities in the world, and the president of that was a guy called Donald Kennedy, who'd written this book on academic duty. And he defined academic duty in these ways: to teach, to mentor, to serve, to discover, to publish, to tell the truth, to reach beyond the walls, and to create change. And my rationale and discussing it with my wife Patricia was that, you know, I don't want to take all of my knowledge and experience with me and bang, it's lost. I want to hand it on to you, because you're going to be taking that baton in the relay of life in relation to global food security, feeding humankind in one way or the other. Why is this important? It's important because the demand for food is growing dramatically. Estimated that we would have to double food production by about 2050, 2060. But that doesn't take into account changing diets. That now people want more meat in their diet. So instead of people directly eating grain, we're now feeding the grain to animals to feed people. It's not as efficient. And so in terms of the pressure that it's putting on our Australian and our global farming systems, what it means is that instead of having to feed about 9 billion people in 2050, 2060, it'll be the equivalent of at least 11.5 billion people, could be 12 billion. So nearly doubling the population that we've got now. An enormous challenge. And that's why I said, this is to me the greatest challenge that you will face and the world will face in your lifetimes. And even now, we're not doing so well. You look at global malnutrition in the world, 2 billion people lack key micronutrients like iron and vitamin A. 155 million children are stunted. 52 million children are wasted. That's about a quarter of the children in the world. And when they're stunted, that means they will never achieve their potential. They will always be behind. And this is something that, you know, is unspeakable really in our current world. But, you know, we live in or are studying here in the paradise of Australia, and sometimes we don't realize these things are happening. But that's emphasizing again the importance of agriculture. Also in that scale, we have 2 billion people in the world now who are actually overnourished in terms of eating too much energy-rich food. 41 million children around the world are overweight. Nearly 90% of countries face a serious burden of either 2 or 3 of those forms of malnutrition. So this is a huge challenge. And when we look at that, it's not going to be easy in agriculture. On your left is from Harvard University, their estimates if everyone ate a healthy diet, what we should need. Half of it, that green area, a lot of fruit and vegetables, some cereals and starches, and some meat, fish, eggs, etc. But you look on the pie diagram on your right-hand side, that's actually what the world's producing compared to what's needed for us all to be healthy. Way over production of cereals and starches, way over production of sugar, and much too little production of fruits and vegetables. So business as usual is actually not going to solve the problems that we're talking about. And diets are not just related to, you know, people's preferences and what happens to people. People's choice of food actually has huge effects on farming systems, on environmental. This article here that says it's headed, "Avoiding meat and dairy is single biggest way to reduce your impact on Earth." This is not an article out of a weekly magazine. This is an article published in Science, one of the 2 top scientific journals in the world. And what it's saying is that basically, if there's beef at the top there and dairy and a few other things, and the grains, etc., down the bottom here, is that your environmental footprint with choice of diet is having an impact on the world. This is not a message that most of us, been associated with traditional agriculture, actually want to hear. So it's another challenge that we have to face up to, because sooner or later, consumers are going to start taking note of this, particularly in industrialized countries. And it's not going to get any easier. Global population is growing by 150 people per minute. They don't have to have cars, they don't have to have TVs, but they all have to be fed. And it's a huge challenge, and those people are not going to be added evenly around the world. Majority of them, as the slide shows, are going to be added in sub-Saharan Africa, which already has a problem in many regions of feeding its population, and certainly in parts of Asia. So the challenge is enormous, and one that we all really have to work to. And as we're sort of looking at achieving more food, more nutritious food for more people, farmers are facing what's called the perfect storm. There can be less land to produce that food on, less water. Agriculture uses 75% of fresh water in the world, freshwater withdrawals. So if we're going to double food production, we're certainly not going to be able to double water production, because it's just not going to be there. So it's just another indication that business as usual is not going to be good enough. And we're all going to have to be working on new ways to achieve this. More food, more people, less land, less water, changing diets, and the multiplier effect of climate change. How much more difficult will climate change make this task be? Hopefully in some places, will it help in some regions, perhaps colder regions now? But it is the unknown, and it is influencing our agricultural systems already. So when you look at the role of agriculture globally in the Anthropocene age that we're in now, it's the biggest lever that we can pull, because agriculture globally, biggest employer of people, biggest water user, as I've just said. About a quarter of the global greenhouse emissions come from the agricultural sector. Nearly 80% of eutrophication, contamination of water, around 90% of the ice-free non-desert lands used by agriculture. It's a main driver of deforestation. But it is the most effective way to lift people from poverty and of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we get agriculture right, it actually can really help all of those things with challenges we're talking about, and we have to get it right. Professor Campbell, who's the Director, CEO, the Director General of ACR, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, said nutrition, along with climate change, is the meta challenge for agriculture and agricultural and food systems research this century. And I would certainly support him in that. And when we look at that nutrition situation, in some ways it's not hard to understand that the 2 million people that have either insufficient access to food, or that food does not have the nutritional qualities that it requires. And shown, a family here in Chad, their food expenditure for the week, $1.20, and the sort of choice that they have. And then look at a typical family in the Western world, food expenditure a week, $500. And one of the problems around this area is that in the industrialized world, the developed world, we waste food. We waste a tremendous amount of food. And 60% of that waste in Australia is from the supermarket to the plate. That we buy too much, let it go off. We purchase too much, phone up, you know, the pizza shop, our family pizza place. Oh, mate, we can give you two for the price of one. Oh, well, why not? Well, what we should be saying is why? Because actually taking two just exacerbates this problem. And I think in the Western world, we've lost our respect for food. Great respect for food in the developing world. You don't know where your next meal is coming from. But we just treat it as a commodity. If we can do something about food waste, we will reduce those pressures on our farming systems. If we could reduce food waste by about 50%, the challenge in 2050, 2060 it'll be about 30% less, and we'll be using less water and less nitrogen. So that's something that is a real opportunity for us. So let's come back to agriculture here in Australia. And you know that the majority of people don't know most of these things. I gave a talk at a farmers meeting last night in the Devonish Hotel, of all places. And you know, I was talking about some of these figures. There was all farmers in that meeting. Most of them didn't know. Agriculture is Australia's fastest growing sector, in front of any other sector. Worth around 60 billion at the farm gate and tracking for 100 billion. Our second largest export industry. And in fact, in 2016, 2017, it was Australia's largest export industry in front of mining. And if you actually split mining into coal and iron ore, agriculture's right up there. And the interesting thing is that agriculture has the highest productivity of all Australian sectors. It's in front of mining, it's in front of health, it's in front of telecommunications. Education, you're part of it. That the enrolments, as we all know, at the University of Melbourne, over 200 in first year this year. And so that's a really healthy sign, as is the participation in the subject food for a healthy planet, one of the biggest subjects in the university. But the reality is, very few people understand this, particularly in the city, and think that, you know, agriculture's sort of, well, something out there, whereas it's actually the leading industry in the country, and we're all part of it. I mentioned that productivity in growth sectors, the baseline, that dotted line up there, that's international average. And you can see that quite a few of our industries, and on your right, are above that. And the far right one is agribusiness. The next one's mining, the next one's health, tourism, oil, etc. So agribusiness right up there in terms of global, against global benchmarks. Top, highest productivity sector in Australia. When we look at that productivity in Australian agriculture, it's pretty impressive. Trending up, of course, it came down when we had the droughts, etc. But it's pushing back up again now. And what it shows is that if there was no new technology, if we didn't have research and development producing technologies, productivity would be the pale blue area. It would have gone down dramatically. The dark blue are the additions that have come from new technologies. And so that gives you the importance of new technologies in terms of certainly engineering, machinery developments, but also agricultural research and development, new varieties, new ways of planting, improved livestock, improved pastures, etc. And so that points out how in a university like the University of Melbourne, the research piece is so critical in contributing to that productivity growth. We look ahead for Australian agriculture, challenges and opportunities. On your left, bar chart showing the rainfall trends in southwest Australia. And this is happening across most of Australia. We're getting drier, getting warmer and drier. can be a challenge for our farming systems. On the positive side, the demands for our products, on the right there, exports of food to China and other countries, just rising up. On average, each Australian farmer feeds 600 people in the world, 150 here in Australia and 450 overseas. So that's why Australian agriculture is really important in this global challenge, because we produce more than we need ourselves, and therefore we can be a significant exporter. But more importantly, in that global food challenge, perhaps our most important export is expertise, Australian agricultural expertise. We can make a bigger impact with that on this global problem than perhaps we can with even some of our food exports. And we need to remember that. And again, you're going to be part of that. So let me now bring it back to Dookie. And I'm part of this faculty of Veterinary and Agricultural Sciences that seeks world-class excellence in research and teaching. And the graduates coming out are very varied. Molecular biologists, social scientists, animal plant scientists, vets, food scientists, engineers, physiologists, agronomists, economists, financiers, consultants, farmers, and more. But the common thing is, for all of you, all of the graduates, is that you've got to understand the industry in which you will work, agriculture. And Dookie delivers this. And so why it's an important part of the whole educational process. What's the role of Dookie campus? It's certainly around sustainable agricultural systems, about sustainable intensification that I talked about, more resilient systems, some of the work being done here on greater stress tolerance in pulses and etc. Applied research, field, glasshouse on farm, postgraduate studies, PhD, masters, undergraduate teaching, as we all know, in all of the years. Our postgrads, this was taken 3 weeks ago, and actually since then, we got 4 more arrivals. So not in that picture. So, you know, we're really building a strong postgraduate cadre here, working on PhDs that have got practical, they're going to have practical value. They're not going to be airy-fairy up here. They're really great projects that people are working on, and we need to support them as well as we can. And thank you, Richard, again for taking that selfie. You did very well. Thank you. And the other thing about the Dookie campus is the engagement with industry, about industry excursions to farms, processors, marketers, etc. The sort of exchange, visits by agronomists and vets and dairy specialists and piggery specialists, sheep and wool, wine, horticulture, all of those things. School visits and all of the organisations in the Golden Valley that we interact with. And these are a key part of the education at this campus here at Dookie. We're looking at building and getting better here, and certainly the Dean and everyone else, the university is right behind this. In the process of really trying to develop a leading edge teaching farm. We're going to have, you know, about 15 to 20 sort of 3-hectare farmlets, and we're going to put some really current and future systems in there, so that as students, you'll get the advantage of working with those for projects, demonstrations, etc. We want to upgrade our glasshouse and animal house and our laboratory facilities. But they're very, you know, some of them are good for teaching, but not for research. We need to get that. I've put those all in red because I've got those on the list for the Dean. We need more money for them. And so that we can focus on sustainable agriculture. And not to sound too much like a Prime Minister, but we're open for business. I want to finish by just saying, so what we want to do with all of the students that come through the faculty is make you aware, not experts in, but aware of the sort of exciting things that are happening at the genetic end of the scale, gene editing, genome engineering, and all the things that that can deliver, but also those things, the digital revolution, the remote sensing, the collecting of data, all of the exciting things were happening. I was talking to this sheep farmer last night at the Devonish meeting, and he was saying, oh, now it's just fantastic. You know, I've got the electronic ear tags on all the sheep. You know, you scan it like that, bang, weight comes up in the yards of the animal, the growth rate, the weight since you last weighed it, the growth rate calculated, etc. You know, bang. He says, it's just amazing. You know, I'd class that guy as a good, a good middle of the road farmer. That, just using that technology. The faculty has just appointed Professor Pablo, and he's a professor in precision agriculture. His expertise is remote sensing and measurements. And he wants to work up here at Dookie because we've got a runway, we can get the plane up, and do some of this work. And we're looking at the potential to remotely sense disease outbreaks or the conditions for these disease outbreaks in canola, maybe some stuff around frosting, whole range of things that it can be done. So these are all great developments, and likely a lot of that will be here. So just in finalizing, what I want to say to you and the students is there's many pathways to contribute, right along from policies, knowledge, the role of research, education, infrastructure, the supply chain, farming or farm management, storage, handling and transport, food processing, food quality, food safety, marketing, retailing, waste reduction and management. All of those are part of this sustainable intensification of agriculture. All of them are really important in contributing to achieving global food and nutritional security. And I put them all in different colors just to say, hey, we're not all going to do the same thing in this. We're not all going to be researchers or all going to be farmers, but we're all going to be contributing in some way or the other. A farming 2030 scenario. One day, Tim receives a notification on his iPhone version 26. His crop management app is warning him of an outbreak of yellow spot, a pretty nasty disease. The monitoring drone has detected the disease in the paddock while Tim was taking a shower. Tim slides through his management options and instructs his sprayer drone to take care of the problem. The drone, like the tractor, knows every inch of the farm, flies straight to the paddock with the disease, but instead of deploying a traditional fungicide, the drone applies to the crop RNA that is specially designed to silence the gene in the pathogen that is required for producing the spores. So instead of spending 8 hours spraying his crop, Tim goes to the footy with his mates and watches the Geelong Cats win again. That scenario on the farm is not far away, and you're all going to be part of that, and many other exciting developments like it. As I said at the start, students, you're the future. It could be a global, local challenges. There's some exciting opportunities out there. There's about 4 jobs waiting for every 1 graduate that comes out of agriculture. You don't know what it's going to be. There's all these different pathways, daunting challenges, expected things, unexpected things. But I can tell you from my experience, they'll be life-changing, they'll be really fulfilling. But what comes with it, given the challenges I've talked about, is responsibility. Because we have to get this right. Actually, I think the future of the world depends on it. Thank you very much.
Okay, Michael. Hello, Michael, can you hear me?
Yeah, microphone again.
Oh.
Yes, I can hear you, Ross.
Yeah, he can hear me. Any questions from your end, Michael?
Do we have any questions?
Surinder.
All this end. Surinder.
You go ahead, I'll ask after that.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's fine.
I'm interested in what Tim's definition is of food security. We received an interesting definition by our lecturer, Bill Malcolm, at the start of the year, saying that it's the ability for a country to continually have a food supply, whether that means they're buying it in via producing products in another sector or producing it themselves. I'm interested in what Tim's definition is of food security, whether that is a self-replenishing system within a country or producing in other sectors where that could be variable as to whether you make money from those exports. Yeah, and also what his definition of sustainability is, because that's also, there's a lot of definitions out there. So, yeah.
Okay, so if I heard you correctly, Tim's definition of food security.
Security and sustainability.
And sustainability.
Yes. Okay. So when we're talking about food security, it depends what level you're looking at. You know, at the national level, it's basically how much food we've got. But once you start to bring that down to the to the global level, once you start to bring that down to the national and regional levels, it's about how much food is there, its availability, its accessibility. Sometimes in the country, there'll be a massive supply of food out on farms that can't be transported for reasons of poor communication into cities. So it is, food security is access to sufficient food for people to live a worthwhile and productive life. And the supply of food can be a part of that. Obviously, the first people that miss out when the pile of food's not big enough are the resource poor, but it's also about access. It's about having the right food there, and it's about how that food is used and processed. Sustainability, simple terms. When we look at that challenge of doubling food production by 2050, 2060, it's not a race that finishes then. And we get there and say, oh, 2050, yeah, double food production. Because the next day, the challenge will be harder. More food, less land, less water, all of the other things we talked about. And so sustainability means that we've got to have productive and profitable farming. Now, we still have to have even more productive and more profitable farming next year, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. And that means our systems have to accommodate that. Quite often, one could argue current cropping systems in Australia, canola wheat, canola wheat, canola wheat, concentrate too much on this year's returns, not enough on sustainability.
Thanks, Tim. Surinder, I think you had a question?
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. Again, great talk as usual. So my question is about, I really like the idea you talked about producing the expertise for the world. So my question is, are we doing enough as a faculty, or what would you suggest to us as a lecturer? How can we help our student to be ready to compete in the global market in terms of extra agriculture experts?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
I think, yeah, they're very good. Thanks, Surinder. Surinder's in India, by the way, zooming in. One of the advantages of the Australian system is that we know what risk is. We know what climate risk is. We know what economic risk is because we don't subsidise our farmers. And these things are really important when you're talking about international agriculture. And also, you know, we have harsh conditions. We have hot, dry conditions and generally poor soils. They're quite characteristic of a lot of countries in the developing world. So the expertise we get here is very relevant to much of the farming systems around the world. I think that what we need to do is to build into increasingly build into the curriculum this sort of focus that we're talking about now. We need to, I think, engage as a faculty more with international research either through ACR, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, through RAID, which a couple of our third-year students were exposed to, Researchers for Agriculture and International Development. It's a young people's organisation. But in the end, when you're going to work overseas, you've got to be very good at something, you know? You can only do something good there if you've got something to bring to the table. So you'll do something really good with your study, further study, possibly, perhaps, and your job, so that in sort of 8 to 10 years' time, you are a really good agronomist, or you're a really good engineer, or a really good social scientist, that you can bring something to the table. So I think that's a really important part of it. And one of the things I would say is, if you want to get into international agriculture in terms of advising on research, you're really going to have to go down the further study, the master's PhD. And basically, it's all about credibility. And a lot of the people you'll be working with in developing countries will have a PhD from a good university somewhere because they got a scholarship, and you need to be a peer of that person to gain their respect.
Any questions here at the Dookie end? Yep, Millie?
So it's just about how to sustainably practice agriculture. So some people might believe that using GMOs might be a way to then practice sustainably. What do you think about integrating GMOs into everyday agriculture in Australia? And how do you think we can overcome, because there's a stigma, I think, around it as well. So how do you think we can overcome that stigma as well against GMOs?
Yep. It's a really good question, and it reflects the fact that agriculture is not just a biophysical exercise about soil and land and water and those things. It's actually very much a social industry as well, and that both at both the community, the producer level, and also the consumer level. Now, in Australia, as you're aware, in agriculture, we've got GM canola in most states, and we've got GM cotton, which are both approved. And the reason they're approved is that neither of them are directly food crops, and that was how they got through. So we don't have any GM food crops at the moment. We lift the level up to the global area. And when I was Director General of CIMMYT, working with developing countries, and what they were saying was, we want you to help us access and evaluate this GM technologies safely, and make sure that we have the results, and then we will make our own decision, because we've got very different priorities and situations to deal with. We don't want to be told by North America we have to have it. We don't want to be told by Europe that we can't have it. We'll make our own decision. And that, we're sort of microcosm of that. All I'll say is that the two biggest consumers of food in the world, China and India, also they're the two largest producers. They're 1 and 2 for wheat production, 1 and 2 for rice production, and 2 and 3 for maize production, and India's the largest dairy producer in the world, etc. But they're the biggest consumers in the world, and they are looking to be going down the GM food, rice it'll probably be initially. That will change the whole world market and, the whole sort of risk element to it. So it'll be, just as there's a very good market for GM canola now, there'll be markets for other, GM food. I suppose the thing now is that when I put that slide up about gene editing and genomics, actually, probably for a number of traits now, they'll be able to achieve without being, GM putting a sort of a foreign gene in to a plant. You'll be able to cut out the bad piece of it that you don't want. So you've got an elite wheat variety. Everything's great about it, except it's become disease tolerant. So you actually pop in a couple of resistance genes from another wheat variety, bang. I'm simplifying it to make the point, you know. And at the moment, that's not being classed as GM technology. There's a debate, but it isn't. And so with genomic breeding for both animals and plants, you're really identifying the genes that are active in terms of, say, stress tolerance, and then concentrating those in the new material. So, you know, it won't happen for herbicide resistance or insecticide resistance, probably, insect resistance, probably, but for a lot of other things, you would probably bypass it in the end. But we do have to have the most efficient plants and the most efficient animals if we're going to meet the challenges. And you know, as someone said in the context of the developing world, where you've got 2 million people, nearly 2 billion people, nearly 1 billion of them who actually go to bed hungry every night. If you didn't look at every opportunity there is to alleviate that, then you stand guilty.
Thanks, Tim. Michael, is there any further burning questions at your end?
Any further burning questions at their end?
No? All right, well...
Michael.
Yep.
Fantastic presentation, Tim. I was just wondering, as upcoming graduates, how can we go into the industry, not just getting a job for a paycheck, but looking for a career that will make a difference in the world?
Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, when I was at your stage, I really had no idea. You know, I just knew I was going to graduate, and I got offered a job in the Victorian Department of Agriculture, and I went to Rutherglen, and I stayed there for 25 years. Within 5 years of leaving Rutherglen, I was Director General of CIMIT in Mexico. You know, it's not a pathway that you would actually recommend to anyone, you know, but the thing that I say is that you want to pick a job that you like. As someone said, if you've got a job that you like, you never do a day's work in your life. A job that you like and that you can really achieve it and work really hard at it. Doesn't matter what it is. You know, I was a young agronomist at Rutherglen, but we were there at the time of inventing direct drilling, zero tillage, and getting canola going, all those things. And really, the rest opens up. You know, I sort of work in my job in sort of 5 to 6 year periods. And that, you know, the thing to do is not to tread water. And, you know, you really put in the effort, you'll get greater satisfaction from it. You know, have a greater impact, and the opportunities will just open up. So, you know, nailing that first job and doing a really good job is important, and life will provide a lot of exciting opportunities. With an agricultural degree, it's amazing the diversity that people go to, you know, and you look around they've been vice presidents of the World Bank, the agricultural scientists. Plenty of other famous things, obviously, in research, etc. But you know, the farmers now, it's all, you know, done Nuffield scholarships, etc. You know, so I mean, you know, boy, their lives have changed. You know, so that would be my advice. There's not one pathway. Get a job that excites you. Do it really well. Let the world unfold.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Well, we might draw the questions to a close at that point. Michael, thank you to you and yours for joining us, and a big warm thank you to Tim for giving us this lovely, you know, and really informative presentation. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.